Russell H. Conwell, Baptist minister and lawyer, became a prophet of the gospel of wealth with his famous sermon, Acres of Diamonds.
He told me the tradition concerning acres of diamonds, which I have used in my lecture 6,000 times.
The sermon, preached some 6,000 times, promised listeners that wealth lay within any American's grasp if they would only accept their Christian duty to work hard and see God's hand through the workings of capitalism. Conwell reinterpreted his Calvinist inheritance for this new corporate age, equating poverty with sin and riches with dutiful virtue. "I say you ought to be rich. You have no right to be poor," he concluded sharply.
He would have had acres of diamonds.
Preachers are grappling with one of the deepest moments of economic inequality in American history. In the midst of the Gilded Age, there's the very rich and the very poor. And churches are among the people debating, how do we decide who to give aid to? How do we decide who to help? And so this language of worthy and unworthy poor develops. And you can see it in any number of my dad's a historian of Christmas, so I always had to read little Victorian Christmas accounts. It's those moments in which people try to give a Christmas present to a poor orphan, and he'll always say, "Oh no, not me. Surely I will earn it on my own someday." So there's a constant rhetoric of who deserves the leg up. And in this deep bootstrapping American mythology takes deeper and deeper roots. And so pastors like Conwell and others who are building up universities and other large structures are trying to appeal to businessmen who themselves are always asking, why am I successful? Or why is someone else doing better than me? And so you can see why positive thinking becomes part of the language of self-help. It becomes part of the manuals that businessmen read when they have to endlessly rely on their own resources. But when we think positive thinking, we have to think largely white, largely middle class, sometimes to upper class, and endlessly bootstrapping. This is the deep American civil religion story about why some people succeed and most fail.
And I have to say, I grew up in the latter part of the 20th century. Positive thinking is something that was almost uniquely identified with America in my mind. There were figures, people like Dale Carnegie, who, by the way, is no relation to Andrew Carnegie, but Norman Vincent Peale is the guy who comes immediately to mind. Can you talk about some of them and how they relate to the gospel of wealth from their positive thinking school of thought?
Sure. And with the Norman Vincent Peale, we have to imagine where he is. He's a famous New York pastor with a national ministry. He's combining his insights with new developments in psychology. So he and a psychologist begin to work together, and they found an institute. And you can see why these become complementary languages of self-mastery. That if somebody has complete authority over the recesses of their mind, they'll be able to harness it all toward the good.
Now, what I want to talk to you about tonight is why positive thinkers get positive results. One reason that the positive thinker gets positive results is he is not afraid of a problem. As a matter of fact, he finds problems exciting.
And so that spiritual and psychological language really entwine and become a very convincingly positive account of what people can do. So you can see why a Norman Vincent Peale is a spiritual inspiration for, say, Donald Trump. It's an overarching theology that imagines a very high anthropology, which is to say a very high view of human potential, the sense that with very little, a self-mastered person can always overcome any circumstance. And Norman Vincent Peale could do it because he was so winsome. He was the guy that you want at every dinner party because he tells, if you've ever read one of these books, they're entirely folksy and anecdotal. They'll offer a quick scripture and then they'll say, I once met a baseball player, trouble with his swing. And in that, they'll draw you in with the individual who struggles for a moment, gathers new resources, and then finds a way around. And it's this kind of everyday solutions that people wanted from a pastor with a huge smile on his face and a sense that his insights were scientifically grounded in a new discipline of psychology.
I said, George, The other day, I was up in the northern part of New York City, in the Bronx, on professional business, if I may thus characterize it. And I was in an area up there where the head man told me that by actual count, there were 150,000 people, and not a single one of them had a problem. The first enthusiasm I saw in George suffused his countenance and lighted up his eyes as he said to me, "Boy, that's for me. Lead me to this place." I said, "Okay, you asked for it. It's Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx."
So you can see why the power of positive thinking becomes a staple for like Amway salesman or a paint can salesman who's on his own. These are the things that people need to turn to, maybe instead of a Sunday devotional, but a little kind of shot in the arm that says, you can do it. I believe in you. God believes in you. Just get back out there.
What about people who don't automatically immediately fit into the fold? People who aren't necessarily automatically true believers, who maybe don't give enough money, who don't respond that way. What happens to them in the congregation or from the church leadership?
Yeah, I think you've really anticipated just how much these are very totalizing environments. They really do ask people to be whole hog, that to the point where some churches will ask for your financial records to ensure that you're giving 10%, for example, then plus more for things like Pastor's Appreciation Day or various other church holidays. So those people are the ones that very often have the hardest time. Is sometimes it means that they'll be very positive on Sunday mornings, but that they're the kind of person who sort of sends me an email on Sunday night that says that they're frustrated with what they're hearing. So they'll find other exhaust valves. Often they'll kind of drift around the periphery of the church. So, sometimes I'd run into someone who wasn't fully invested in its message of health and then would just kind of openly come to church with a giant cold and then sniffle and sneeze and not pray about it. And, those people, I think, were lovingly tolerated, but they're never going to be the people in power. They're never going to be the people at the center of the church. And very often they drift away. And I've interviewed people who say, well, I'll come back when I've got my life together. And that, I think, is one of the hardest parts, is it creates isolation. If it makes individuals out of every person, it says you are responsible for your faith, you are responsible for your health and your wealth and ultimately your fate, then it does require that when people suffer, that they almost always suffer alone. God's healing promise was that all who ask will receive healing. But few who received God's blessings keep them. As Benny Hinn explained, quote, God's healing promise was that all who ask will receive healing. But few who received God's blessings keep them. We all know that in the presence of God there is healing, and I would give all that I have to see people healed. So I really believe it's the fault of the person. They have failed to enter God's presence and allow Him to touch them, unquote. One interviewee described his father's place of prominence within a faith church until he was stricken with cancer. Weekly, his father would go up to the altar for prayer. The church leaders stopped him at the altar one day and instructed him to stop coming for prayer. Quote, "There's nothing else anyone can do for you," they said. "You have to heal yourself."